Requisite for presidential candidates. Without further ado, in order to start the debate, I'd like to call upon Prime Minister Mr. Son Jun-pyo to open the case for side government.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In principle, we concede that any limits on the presidency and limitations of presidential candidates is bad. But when the preservation of the state is threatened, it is the commander-in-chief, in other words, the president, that must be capacitated with direct military experience. And it is integral that the president knows the basics of state and warcraft. That's exactly why Team Taiwan A today is saying that this House believes that military service should be a prerequisite for all presidential candidates. But before I move on directly to my arguments, I'd like to define a few key terms. First, I'd like to define military service as serving in the national military in direct combat training and strategy situation, such as but not limited to situations that, for example, we have in Korea. And prerequisites as fundamentally banned from running, and presidential candidate as people running for presidency, the head of the state and the commander of the chief. And then we think it's necessary to set a few parameters for this debate to be more clear. We'd like to set this in countries with mandatory military service, with China, Germany, Iran, Israel, South Korea, Mexico, Russia, and a total of 33 countries. Secondly, we'd like to set the parameters of external security threats exist. Countries of Balkan Peninsula, Middle East, South Korea. We think this is actually acceptable in many cases. Thirdly, we'd like to talk about how, in the cases of women, in the cases of disabled, in the cases of other people that are physically or mentally impossible to go to the military, we'll have them sent through community services, so that they have a just substitution to the military service that is required for this country, as we are already doing in many cases. The reasons for setting this parameter is that we concede in basic principle that this policy is an evil in terms of fairness. But we consider that this to be a necessary evil. That in times of peace and tranquility, it is not necessary. But in times of war, survival is of utmost importance. Preservation of the state is paramount. And this debate is about whether setting restrictions, even in emergency situations, is justifiable. And under the team line, we must first survive to thrive. Team proposition gives you 3 substantive points on why the motion must stand. First, preservation of the state, talking about the principle in why this motion must stand. Secondly, nature of presidency, and talking about the pragmatics. And thirdly, post-war democracy. I, as the Prime Minister, will be dealing with the first two, and here it goes. First, the preservation of the state. Within any value system, ladies and gentlemen, the most important value is the sanctity of life. In other words, the right to survive. When it comes to statecraft, that becomes the preservation of the states, and that we say that it is of paramount importance. Other values can only be present when the state is able to ensure its survival. And ladies and gentlemen, when there are external security threats, the state must do its best to protect itself. In times of war, free market is even breached. The fundamental principle that our economy operates upon. We say the same exception can be taken in this kind of case too. Factories are converted to weapons factories. The right to movement is circumscribed by curfews. Asking that presidential candidates be versed in basic military experience is the least we can ask for our president, our commander-in-chief, who will be commanding all the military forces to strive to preserve our state. And we say that our restrictions are justified, because or else we leave ourselves to die. Secondly, I'd like to talk about the nature of presidency, the actual pragmatics of this debate and this motion. We've told you what the principal background of our condition is. We talked about how the preservation of the state is at utmost value, especially in the parameters we set it for this debate. And we say, so let us show the pragmatic background. Why must the president be versed in military affairs, in basic combat and warcraft abilities? First, we'd like to talk about the fact that the president is the commander-in-chief. Who decides to go to war? who decides when we pull out. It is the commander-in-chief, in other words, our own president. It is in fact, though the micro decisions in combat are made by the officers or other generals, the macro decisions are made by the commander-in-chief, again, the president. We can give you the example of Obama decided to go in and invest Afghanistan, Clinton in Somalia, Israel, the Gaza strike was issued by the Prime Minister Netanyahu, Russia going to Georgia. Every single case, the choice was made by the president, and the responsibility of that action was upon the president and the commander-in-chief. For these people to actually take responsibility of the decisions that they make, we think a necessary experience in military service is absolutely necessary.
Sir?
Yes, sir.
All the decisions you're talking about, the choices that the president made were advised by other officials with expertise.
We think when the issue is the preservation of the state and external threats posing extreme threats to that condition, that the commander-in-chief himself needs to have at least a basic understanding of it. Because advisors, ladies and gentlemen, because advisors have a limit in advising the president, and advisors have a limit in instructing the president on what to do. The final value decision should be made by the president, and that cannot be substituted with the decisions of generals. People who only talk about the theaters of war and only talk about how to win the war better. We think the value judgment considering the interest of the state must be made by the president, and we think that's very clear for you. Again, military command operation and respect for the service and the lives of our soldiers are all decisions that simply people, generals and military officers cannot make for the state, because what they're concerned about is to kill more people and actually to win wars. So the timeline goes like, when the president makes that value decision, when the president talks about and is concerned with the preservation of the state, makes the decision to go into war, then comes in the advisors advising how to fight that war better, not the other way around. So we say that some kind of experience in combat, again in warcraft, is necessary for this president to make that very important decision well, ladies and gentlemen. And so we also give you the example of Bush in Iraq and President Lee in Korea, China, and how these presidents these presidents weren't the best example of fighting these combat wars. Therefore, president must be capacitated with military experience and therefore talk about these things. Second level of analysis is a horrible alternative. It can be argued that military personnel can take care of war and military duties for the president. But that's the horrible alternative, as addressing your POI. The military is only apt at making military decisions and when at war. And they will not consider the socio-economic background of that nation and the implication of that decision. So we say, today on government, we say that socio-economic implications and military interests have to be considered together. And that will only be the case when the president has deep understanding of military affairs. Because the other part is they will naturally come through as he is the head of state and the head of the military. And therefore, from a pragmatic perspective, the president should be capacitated with military experience. And ladies and gentlemen, that is exactly why Team Taiwan A is proud to stand on proposition in this finals. Thank you very much.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 4 seconds.
Okay, I thank the previous speaker for his remarks. And to start off the case for team opposition, we'd like to invite Ms. Eunjin Yu to open the case for the opposition.
The danger of fighting a monster is that we can become one. This was a quote made by Friedrich Nietzsche. It is not in times of peace and tranquility, but in times of turmoil and discord that we prove the strength of our democratic system. Today, the opposition will not become an enemy to its people. We will not stand by the breach of fairness and democratic principles. Today, we will not stand by discrimination, and we will certainly not stand by prohibiting certain demographics from becoming president. Now, today, the opposition, because it stands for the values of true democracy, would like to present you 3 substantive points. First is safeguarding democracy. Second is negative cycle of discrimination. And third is the danger of military influence. And I, as the leader of opposition today, will talk about the first two substantive points, and our deputy leader of opposition will handle the last point. Now, before I move on to substantiating our case, I would like to first rebut to what the proposition has proposed today. Now, first of all, they come up here and give us the parameters of this debate. However, the fact is, ladies and gentlemen, the proposition today has place set, and we know that place setting for a debate is not allowed because we must all have the same basis for having our arguments. And now, even if the place set is valid, I would like to say how their parameters today was not valid. Now today they said that it was only for countries with mandatory military conditions. However, we say that in these countries it is already mandatory, so that presidents will all have gone to the military anyway. We say that this was an unnecessary parameter that was given by the proposition today. Needed by proposition today. So we deem this as unnecessary. But for the spirit of debate, let's just say that their parameters and their definition actually was valid. Now we have other rebuttals to what the proposition has proposed today. First of all, they said that it was important for the preservation of the state, and now it is of paramount importance. Now, we concede to the fact that the preservation of the state is of paramount importance, and we, the opposition, value that as well. However, secondly, the fact is, they said that they did not prove how military service is actually going to help this preservation of the state. Because we say that military service, what we learn is not how the specifics about war. It's not about the macro levels of war. And they said that because the president is the one that makes the macroeconomic decisions, that they are the ones that need to have knowledge about military service. However, we ask the question, does military service actually give these knowledge to the participants of military service? We say that military service is actually more about simple training. It's about the very basic training, and it will not impact the decision-making of the president to an extent where the president cannot make valid decisions. Third of all, we as the opposition, as we said in our POIs, have said that we already have generals, we already have many advisors that have professional knowledge about war, that actually have the knowledge about the army and the military that is going to aid the president before they make the decision. The fact is that presidents don't make their decisions alone. We already have a system where generals and Secretary of Defense can aid the president, and we think that is enough for these countries to ensure their security. Yes, sir.
So are you saying that the most important decision for a nation to make, it should be made by military officers and generals?
We're not saying that military officers should be the one that makes it. We're saying that the president, along with his other knowledge and his other value of the lives of the citizens, will take that knowledge into consideration and make a decision considering both of the factors. So we say that it is unnecessary for these people to actually go to military service because the current system is good enough. And second, and the second point, they also mentioned about socioeconomic and military, how the president should consider both of these factors. We say that was rebutted in the point about how presidents can make the decision with the advisors. So we would consider that point rebutted. And now that I have rebutted all the points of the proposition side, I would like to move on to our substantive case. Now, first is the safeguarding democracy, and we have two levels of analysis under this. First is the nature of military service, and second is that it harms democracy. Now, it is an incredible assumption to think that military service is a universal and unanimous service. The fact is that many demographics are fundamentally excluded from service by law, by belief, and by demographic. And I know that the proposition today has proposed a other standard that says that other people can go to have replacement for this. However, if they have replacement for this, we ask that under the proposition's logic, doesn't that undermine the whole point of military service itself? Because they said it was because these countries are in danger, because they needed to make decisions about war, that they needed to have military service. We do not see how they can be consistent under their case with their exception. And we say that if we are to consider that there are other demographics that cannot have military service in its essence, can we say that these people are not qualified to be presidents? We say that that's absolutely not true. And we say that even women and even people that are handicapped have the ability to become a president and make decisions for its nation. And now secondly, how this harms democracy. The fact is that the right to democracy and the right to express our views comes in two ways. First, in suffrage and in voting. And second is in running and being eligible for office. By requiring military service, by putting a requirement on the people that can actually run for president, we say that that is something that is harmful in itself. We are saying that we're putting restrictions on who gets to represent our people. And we say that the representative of a democratic nation should be the ones that are picked by citizens. And by requiring military service, we say that we strip a substantial, if not majority of the population from half of their democratic rights. And now the fact is, if we are trying to, that under the proposition's logic, the point of protecting ourselves falls. Because if we rape our values and lay an illegitimate child of discrimination, we're turning the clock back on democracy. And we say that democracy, because it is something that we stand for, that there will be no purpose of fighting a war if it goes against the standard of democracy. Now second, moving on to the second point on negative cycle. Now, limiting the president is first. We ask what next? Congress, the judicial branch, the right to vote? Democracy is a hard value to protect because it takes only one victory for tyranny for democracy to crumble. And we give you the example of Jim Crow laws or the laws of apartheid. We saw that our proposition's case is actually no different. It will move to encourage discrimination. The fact that Obama's ascension to presidency was monumental because racism was included in culture. And now proposition wants to write it in law. And we say turning the clock on democracy and starting a cycle of bad democracy is not what the opposition wants to promote today. And because the proposition side today had many faults on the basic parameters itself, and because it stood for the wrong values of democracy, because it limited the choice for its citizens, it limited the values that democracy actually promotes. We as the opposition say we cannot agree to a government that does that. Thank you.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 8 seconds.
Okay, I thank the Leader of the Opposition for her speech. To continue the case for the side government, I'd like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister, Ms. Yarin Yang.
Why does our president need to know about basic military standards? Because he has advisors. That's what the opposition said, right? But advisors aren't always right. And just because presidents have advisors about economy and military doesn't mean they can be completely ignorant of their subject. Because the fact of the matter is, ladies and gentlemen, president needs a certain amount of knowledge in all the areas, especially in the perimeters of this debate that we said, in places with external national conflict. We need a president who has a basic knowledge about the military. And making military requirements a prerequisite for being a president will serve just that position. Now, our Prime Minister gave you two very clear substantive points. Number one, the preservation of the state. And number two, the nature of presidency. And to that, the opposition has mainly three contentions. The first contention was about our perimeters of the debate. They said that it was unfair, yet they did not challenge our definition. But we say that this is not unfair because this is for the spirit of the motion, because we're talking about countries with external conflicts. And in countries with external conflicts, this motion stands because we need a president, that is well versed in military knowledge. Now, also they said that there are certain places that don't make requirements of military service, but we say this is not in our definition, therefore invalid. And seeing as they conceded to our definition and didn't make any challenges, we take this entire point as conceded. Our second contention was about the preservation of the state. Now, they said, how is military service going to help? Going to the military doesn't teach you anything. Well, that's factually untrue, ladies and gentlemen. They're undermining basic system of mandatory military service, because when you go to military, they don't just teach you how to handle guns. They teach you about the fundamentals of military and the basics of what it means to protect a nation and to secure a nation from war and from other harms as that. And our presidents need that, ladies and gentlemen. Now, nextly, they talk about advisors and how if a president has advisors, that means he could completely trust them to make all the decisions and run amok that country. Well, first of all, ladies and gentlemen, advisors aren't always in for the best intent of the country. Sometimes advisors are in for the best intent of themselves. We give you the example of Myanmar when the military junta didn't try to let go of the power after military turmoil. Now, if the president in Myanmar had basic military requirements, he wouldn't have been so naive as to give up the control to a military general. And we see that this is exactly why we must make military service a prerequisite for being a president. And secondly, just because there are advisors and they might be ethically right, doesn't mean that the president always has to depend on them. We see that the president must have a basic level of knowledge in that area, especially when we are in a war impending situation. Their second point of contention was their second point was contention about our point on nature of presidency. And she only said, well, I've addressed this before, so I don't need to talk about that. Well, she didn't address it, and we're challenging the deputy to address this point because they've completely dropped it by saying that they've talked about it before, when in reality they haven't. And now that I've addressed all the opposition's rebuttals, let us move on to their own case. We have mainly two contention. Our first contention is about their first substantive point, about safeguard. First, they talk about the nature of military services. And they say some places don't have military services, a mandatory military service. But ladies and gentlemen, that wasn't in the perimeters of the debate. We were talking about countries that do have a mandatory military system. And since they haven't challenged that, we still take this point. Also, they said that we don't let certain people represent our people, and we don't let certain people become presidents, and that we're putting restrictions on who will represent our people. Well, first of all, where are these restrictions? We asked them to name a few, because as far as we know, we're not saying that all presidents in America must be white. We're saying that all people must have a military requirement service. And for the people like the women and the disabled people they mentioned, we have things such as community service. And women can also go to the military. And as our team line, we told you that we must first survive to thrive, and desperate times call for desperate measures, and we need these measures to ensure the national security of our country in such time of impending doom and disaster. And secondly, they talk about the negative cycle of discrimination, and they link Jim Crow laws to our policy. Ladies and gentlemen, this is simply not true. Jim Crow laws were a set of laws about segregation, racial segregation. Do we set any racial segregation for our policy? Do we say that a person must be from a certain race color to be a president? We didn't have that. We only had military requirements, which could be fulfilled by most people. And for the people who can't fulfill this military requirement, we told you that we're going to make them do other things that give them a similar background knowledge as well. Now that I've rebutted all the points made by the opposition, I'd like to move on my own substantive point, which is about post-war democracy. Well, we realize that wars can end, and that external threats can be dissolved. When wars end, we need to return to the normal status. Factories need to be furniture factories, not tank factories. People are allowed to drink and party beyond 12 midnight, but we need other infrastructures back online. If the president was not capacitated with military prowess and handled too much power to the military, the post-war statecraft would be inhibited. In other words, for post-war democracy to be good, we need a president that is more in control during the war and to hold the reins when the war is over. Now, team opposition come here and talk about protecting democratic values. They talk about democracy, democracy, democracy. But we say that if you truly stand for democracy, you're for a side proposition. Because without a country with a strong military personnel as the president, and without a president that doesn't have basic knowledge about the military, when there is impending doom, then the democracy of that country can very well fall. We give you the example of Myanmar and Egypt, as I already mentioned. Well, after the turmoil was over, the president, who didn't have much of a military experience and knowledge, naively ceded too much power to the military general who basically took over the country. Now, he didn't let go of the power, and the nation's democracy was lost forever. And that is what is going to happen under team opposition stance. And we can't stand for that. And also, once the country had impending doom, although it was over, it may very well start again. So during the instances of future war, a president needs to make these sort of decisions again. For post-war recovery, we say that military requirements is necessary. We give you the example of Germany, where after they suffered from the war, they instilled a prime minister that had military experience, and Germany has been much better off since then. And now, even in the 1960s, they weren't considered a democratic country, but now they are, because they had a strong president with military knowledge to back up their country's plans. So if you're for not only the national security, but also for democracy, you're for side proposition, and we're very proud to propose. Thank you.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 6 seconds.
I thank the previous speaker for her remarks. To continue the case for side opposition, I'd like to call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, Hyun-Jung Lee.
Ladies and gentlemen, in order for side opposition to take this debate home, they have to prove to us how military service for presidential candidates actually makes these presidential candidates adequate in making decisions when it comes in making military decisions. Because throughout the whole debate, side proposition has been linking, without any clear logical linkage, that if a presidential candidate receives military service and fundamental knowledge about the military, they will automatically be able to make good decisions for the country's military strategies. So we say for side proposition to prove to us how military service actually makes these presidential candidates adequate in making macro decisions, they have to prove to us how this military service actually influences and educates these presidential candidates. Now, as a Deputy Leader of Opposition, I'll be elaborating on our side's third substantive argument, which is about the danger of military influence. But before moving on to our own substantive case, I'll first like to look at what happened in the debate so far. Now, from the very beginning, they gave us this parameter, and we said it was unfair. But then we still agreed to debate under this parameter, ladies and gentlemen, because we recognized that even under this parameter, their policy didn't work, because under their parameter in countries with mandatory military service, these presidential candidates would already have gone to military service. So we thought that was completely unnecessary. So to the Deputy Prime Minister's point about why we thought it was unfair, we say we agreed to debate under their parameters, so we will stick to their parameters. And let's look at something else that they've said. Side proposition came up and told us from the Deputy Prime Minister's big speech that the president has to have knowledge about the military in order to make military decisions. Well, we saw a case shift in side proposition's stance throughout these first two speeches, because at first they portrayed military service as something that gives a lot of military knowledge and something that will intensively teach these people about what the military is really like. But then they moved on to say that the military service isn't just about intensively teaching these people, but they said it's only a fundamental level of education that everyone deserves. We say that we want to hear from side proposition what they really meant when they said military service. Because if it's a fundamental level that everyone must go through, we say that it can be achieved through other means, not military service itself. And if it is intensive military service that enables these presidential candidates to become military leaders, we say that there are advisors in these specific fields to take care of those military knowledge, and that the presidential candidate, if he's able to make macro-level decisions for the country, then they should be eligible to run for the election. Now, side proposition, so the Deputy Prime Minister came up and rebutted to our rebuttals to their substantive arguments. Now, to their substantive arguments about the preservation of the state and the nature of presidency, our leader of opposition came up and gave you two very clear rebuttals. First, she said that military service doesn't really teach the presidential candidate the specifics about war. So she said that it was unnecessary for these presidential candidates to have learned about the specifics of war through military service. And then to the second point about the nature of presidency, she said that the commander-in-chief didn't have to know about the many different factors, all the different factors that have to be considered in a military decision. And she clearly refuted to their second argument. But side proposition came up and said that we didn't address their argument at all. But let me clarify that rebuttal for you again, ladies and gentlemen. What we were saying was that the commander-in-chief, if he is to consider from a macro level perspective what is best for the country, can gather knowledge from his advisors, because he has different advisors that have a specialty and expertise in their in their own fields. So we say that if this commander-in-chief is someone that can look at all those different perspectives and make it make it a decision that will help their country, then that's what makes a good commander-in-chief, not a commander-in-chief who's actually had first-hand military service. And then to our two arguments about safeguarding democracy and the nature of presidency, they have 2 points of refutation overall. First, she said that they weren't really setting restrictions, and then in the second rebuttal, she also said that they weren't setting restrictions. Well, to those two identical refutations, we have 1 point of refutation. First, we say 2 points of refutation. I'm sorry. The first refutation is that we believe that military service, requiring military service as a prerequisite for all presidential candidates, is a restriction in itself. That's the restriction that we had a problem with. So if they're going to prove to us how that's not a so instead of side proposition coming up here and saying that just because military service isn't the same as race, it's not a restriction, we say that they have to prove how this isn't really restricting these different people. Because we think that requiring all these people to have military service and making that a prerequisite for a presidential candidate is a restriction in itself. Our second point of refutation is about what the Deputy Prime Minister said about the Jim Crow law. Now, we believe that that's not what's happening because of this restriction, but we believe that once we start limiting the prerequisites for the presidential candidacy, then once we start limiting that, it could result in something as extreme as a Jim Crow law, because we believe that military service is an unnecessary prerequisite and restriction. So we believe that it could lead to dangerous outcomes. That's what we were trying to say on side opposition. So having refuted to their arguments, I would now like to move on to our side's third substantive argument. No, thank you, ma'am. About the dangers of a military influence. Now, ladies and gentlemen, there's a reason you keep the military and the police separate. One fights the enemy of the state, and the other. One fights the enemy of the state. No, thank you, sir. And the other protects and serves the people. But we believe that if the military starts doing both of that, the enemy of the state tends to become the people. Now, once you require military service, we believe that the military is going to have a political clout, because we're requiring all our political leaders to have a background in the military service. We believe that the people that control politics will be these military leaders. So what is the danger of military influence? Well, ladies and gentlemen, we say that we already saw an example in our own country in which President Park Chung-hee actually took over power and kept that power through his strong grip on the military. We also see an example of President Mubarak in Egypt. in which he uses that military power and the military influence that he has to violate the people's rights and to put a stop to democracy. So, ladies and gentlemen, we say that the military influence and the military strength that side proposition wants to build so much for our presidential candidates won't result in the perfect and ideological situation in which the presidential candidate is able to make their decisions, because we see the potentials for abuse. So, ladies and gentlemen, because that opposition believes that their policy was first completely unnecessary, and because it has the further dangers, we say that we beg to oppose. Thank you.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 14 seconds.
Moving to the second half of this debate, we'd like to invite the government whip, Mr. Min-chul Cho.
The biggest misconception that the opposition side and the biggest misconception that we both had in our debate was why we set the parameters. Because there was a clear reason behind setting these parameters. Actually, when we set the parameter to states where military service was mandatory, we were limiting the circumstance to states that were actually in visible danger. States that believed that there was a clear threat to their nation, that we had to do something mandatory to protect our state. And that is why we believe that the guy who actually made the big decisions, the guy actually who made the final calls, really needed to know about the stuff. Because, first of all, the state is in possible danger. It is in a big enough threat and a big enough danger that they are mandatoralizing military service, because the reason they are doing it, the biggest reason they employ mandatory service to its citizens is because we are in critical need of soldiers who are going to protect our country. And then comes the big question behind this parameter that the opposition side never answered. If the country is really in a critical state of war, if the country is threatened of losing its national sovereignty, if the country in simple terms is in war, what are you going to do if the president doesn't know a damn thing about it? Well, that's what we're here to answer. Because we want a president who knows something in the case of war. Because we want a president who can deal with the aftermath of the war. Because we believe that in these states, they are in the brink, or they are in a danger of a possible future war. We want to deal with it in a preemptive measure. And that is why we were saying that military service, which is often disregarded, needs to be mandatory for these people. Now, before we actually go in, we want to make a few remarks regarding the Deputy Leader of Opposition. The Deputy Leader of Opposition said that we had a K-shift, but the K-shift was not exactly clear from the beginning. We said that we required intensive knowledge, then we talked about fundamental knowledge, but that's not really true. What we were talking about, what they keep on asking about the military decisions was that what the real essential stuff, the stuff that you can't learn anywhere else but only in the military. The reason why we believe military service is really crucial when it comes to presidential services is because military service and serving in the military provides certain experiences and hands-on experience and knowledge that no book or no other education or lecture can teach. No, thank you, ma'am. We give examples of war simulations, strategics, and simulations and practices of war and shooting that cannot be done in lectures and books and in other educations. Because basically what we're asking for in these presidents, by asking them to go to the military, is we're asking them for a capacity to deal with emergency situations regarding the military. We ask for the same thing when it comes to education, when it comes to law, when it comes to other parts and other fields in the government that what the government deals with. When we look at those, when we are trying to assess the president's capacity regarding those fields, we can see what kind of university they went to, what kind of education they had, what kind of private life they have, what kind of policies they are pushing. But we really can't see that when it comes to military service unless we are sure that they have actually been to the military themselves, that they have actual hands-on experience on what is important when it comes to war, when it comes to big decisions, when it comes to protecting the country and a real danger. No, thank you, ma'am. Now, basically we saw three big misconceptions in the opposition side's case. The first is that the advisor can never really substitute the president. First of all, the sphere of knowledge in this case, if the president does not know a thing about the military, and the president has not been to the military himself, would require the sphere of knowledge would be limited to the sphere of knowledge of the advisor. Now, when you go to a doctor because you're critically ill, and when you're critically ill, you first ask for his opinion, then ask for a second opinion. The reason we believe that presidents should know about military service and really have this experience and hands-on experience regarding war and decisions is because whatever opinion they seek, it is an opinion basically. And you need actual knowledge before you make a good decision, because good decision entails knowledge and knowledge on that matter. Also, the second misconception was that during elections and when presidential candidates are actually trying to support and rooting for a seat as the president, that military is often disregarded. That military is not something people really seek in these people. That often we just end up looking at what kind of university he attended to, what kind of education he received, what kind of policies and public welfare policies he is pushing. But actually, what is equally important in these nations where military service is mandatory and where war is a very visible threat is how can this president react when the country is in real threat, when the country is at the verge of losing its national sovereignty. And those kind of values can only be really assessed when the president himself has been to the military. And if we don't judge that, and if we keep on ignoring this very fact that these people really need to know about their stuff, then we're going to keep on having presidents who are going to make lousy decisions when actual war comes. The third and last misconception was on the military decision, how the sphere of knowledge will be limited, as briefly mentioned in the introduction, to the advisors. And when you're making a decision, you need to know about this stuff on your own before you actually start seeking for opinions. Now we'd like to move on to the three clashes we've identified in this debate. The first was on the president's role, the second was on discrimination, and the third was on dealing with the aftermath. Now regarding the first clash, the president's role, the real question regarding the president's role is this: is it really substitutable by advisors? Because when it comes to advisors, it's not like we just have military advisors. We have advisors in other fields as well. We have secretary generals, and we have secretary generals, and we have generals, secretary of state, and we have the Minister of Education. We have other people who are in charge of advising other stuff and other fields for the president as well. But when it comes to the military, and what is so partial about the military is, as mentioned repeatedly, that there is some hands-on experience and some simulation and some sorts of real quick thinking and about other values that can only be accumulated and they can only be gained through actual participation in military activity and military service. And because these sorts of information are crucial when it comes to real crisis situations, which they have never actually dealt with, because all their arguments were based on were based on the conditions, and were attacking the situations when the country was not in a stage of war, and in a stage of peace, and in a stage when democracy can be really questioned and debated. They were really missing the fact that what really matters and what really needs to be prioritized in situations of war and in situations of dire, then what we really need to value is these presidents' capacity to deal with it. So we believe we take this first clash. We believe that the president's role in these dire situations is to actually know about the stuff they're deciding. The second clash was on discrimination. How they mentioned that certain demographics were being excluded because we were employing mandatory military service. Well, we first see that there is already certain limitations to demographics. We see that, for example, in Korea, where military service is mandatory, that only candidates who are above the age of 45 can actually participate in presidential elections, and that is because we believe certain limitations are necessary when it comes to deciding who really administrates, or who's the guy who makes the final call. As mentioned in the Prime Minister's speech, we set the parameters for a reason, because we believe that there was an imminent danger, and because we wanted to deal with that danger well. If there are limitations that can be justified because of these parameters, and because of the same reasons we set the parameters, we believe that this applies to this case as well. And also, as repeatedly mentioned, people tend to ignore the fact or ignore the importance and the significance of the person attending to military when it comes to these cases. And therefore, we believe we take this clash of discrimination as well, because really there was no discrimination. We were just trying to look for a really capable person for a really demanding job. The third and last clash was dealing on the post-war, but there was really not much of a conflict here. We asked them, how are you going to deal with the post-war situation and the aftermath of war, when the president does not know about military stuff, and military advisors have already gained a lot of leverage. They never really answered the question, and therefore we believe we take this clash as well. And therefore, since we protected the country from real danger, because we actually dealt and assessed with the real difficult crisis situations, we believe we take this debate, and we are very proud to propose. Thank you.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 40 seconds.
I thank the previous speaker for his speech. And to continue the case for opposition, I'd like to invite opposition witness Hee-Soo Kim.
May I start? Let's go directly into looking at the proposition and the opposition we had in today's debate. Let's look at the proposition. First, they didn't really have a clear standard of what military service is and what military service does from the beginning of the debate. And as we clearly said throughout our speeches, they shifted on what their value of military service really was. In the beginning, they said that military service will give hands-on experience in actual combat in war. But then later they said that military service will actually give just the basic knowledge of military service that a president actually needs. Well, we actually see that they don't really have a firm stance on what military service is, so we don't really see the point of the debate. And then second, we see that this military service, if it really just gives basic knowledge of the military, that it can actually happen through other methods. And the proposition never responded to this point. No, thank you. And before moving on, let's look at what military service actually is in reality. When you go to military service in Korea, do you really know everything that happens in war? Do you really know all of the things, and can you actually gain the experience that you can make the decision during war as a president of a certain nation? We don't really think this, and we think that their stance on military service false. So second, let's look at the parameters that the proposition set for you today. We say that by setting the parameters in the first place, even if we debated with this, they're conceding to the fact that their values stand within a limited area and within a limited place. So they're conceding to the fact that their values are limited. However, let's look at the opposition. The opposition said we shouldn't be discriminating, and we shouldn't be blocking people to become a president of a certain nation just because they didn't have military service. And I'll go further on to this later in my speech. So let's look at the three main clashes of today's debate that I found. So the first one was on the parameter that the proposition set, and the second was on restrictions, and third was on presidency. So let's move on to the first clash of the parameter that the proposition set. Now the parameter was that first the parameter was within the countries that already have mandatory military service. But as our deputy leader of opposition clearly said, we don't really see the necessity of their policy, because even if it's in a state where military service is already mandatory, then they already got military service, so their policy reason really isn't necessary. Their second parameter was that they're going to exclude women and people who are physically and mentally incapable of going to military service. We don't really see what the problem is then, because that is the status quo, because we don't have people who aren't capable of going to military service in the first place. And even if this stood, then their whole case is undermined by the proposition themselves, because they said that military service is something that should be a quality that a president has. Then the people who are women and the people who are incapable, like handicapped people, then they're going to have community service instead of military service. So in the end, they really are discriminating women from becoming presidents, and they are discriminating physically handicapped people from being going out to from being a presidential candidate. So we don't really see why they set the parameters in the first place, and because their whole case was based on the parameters that they set at the beginning of the speech, we see that their case falls. However, let's look further on to the debate and let's move on to the second clash of restriction. Now, the proposition came up here and said repeatedly that they're not really discriminating people, However, we really don't see how there's not a restriction by setting this prerequisite, but that presidential candidates, should go to military service. We say that the proposition said that there's no limit, that they're not really setting a restriction, they're not really limiting presidential candidates because we're not really limiting them by race. And because it's not racial restriction, it's not a restriction at all. But however, we believe that by preventing some people, the some people we're referring to in this case is some people who didn't go to military service for whatever reason, are going to be discriminated from being a president of a certain nation. So we believe that there is a restriction that the proposition themselves said today. However, let's look at what the opposition gave you. We said that there was in fact was a restriction, and we said that there's no limit to this restriction that the government is going to give. First, they're going to restrict that a presidential candidate needs to go to military service, but then we don't know where this is going to stop because they don't really have a clear standard on why this restriction stands. So in the future, they can restrict Congress members to go to military service, and we don't really know where this restriction set by the government is going to stop, which was never responded to by the proposition. And we also said that at the end of the day, we said that the opposition is the one who stands for no discrimination of people who can actually be a presidential candidate. So because we stood on a higher moral ground on restrictions, and we believe that in fact there is a restriction that the proposition is setting today, we believe that we won this clash as well. So let's move on to having dealt with the second clash, let's move on to the third clash of presidency on what they actually do. So a huge clash in the debate that went on back and forth was if the president actually makes the decision when we go to war. And they said that just because the president is the one who says that we're going to war or we're pulling out, doesn't mean that the president made that decision all on his own. We say that there are advisors who have military expertise who advise the president, the executive in chief. And we believe that when this president makes the final macro decision, as they call it, we say that all of the things that the opposition believes that all of the things said by the advisors are taken into consideration. And we believe that in fact, that if presidents need this basic information of basic knowledge and fundamental knowledge of military, they can get it through other methods and use the advisors with military expertise who have more experience than them to make the better choice for them. And to this they rebutted, well, advisors don't really act in the people's interest. We believe that this rebuttal was based on a total assumption, so this doesn't stand. So let's look at what the opposition said today. We said that the president is a person who represents its people. The president is a person who is picked by the people because they represent the people. If it's not something that military service isn't a standard used by the public to choose a president, we say then what's wrong with it? The people are the ones being represented, and if they don't think that that's such a huge standard when they're picking a president, we say that that's the right of the people who are being represented. So if you stand for a better democracy, and if you oppose a proposition that had a shaky stance on their case to begin with, if you stand for side opposition.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 22 seconds.
Moving to the reply section of this debate, we'd like to invite the speaker from opposition, Ms. Eunjin Yu.
For the opposition to agree with the government side today, they needed to do 3 things. First is they needed to effectively identify the problem in the status quo. Secondly, they needed to give us an effective solution to the problem that they identified. And third, they needed to prove to us that the value that they stood for was actually left standing at the end of the debate. Now, I'm going to show you in my opposition reply speech how the government did not do any of these things. Now, first of all, the problem that they identified was that simply that countries in external conflict, in these situations, national security is paramount. And the fact is, we agreed to this. But the fact is, the contention started when they said that military service is what's going to secure these nations the national security. The fact is, their point today was based on many contradictions and was only left a confused stance for the government. The fact is, the proposition today conveniently had one magical word for good national security and good decisions: military service. And they said that because of military service, these leaders, heads of state, will be able to make good decisions based on real knowledge about what happens in the war, and that they will suddenly receive the enlightenment to what it takes to actually run a war, to the values that they have to base their opinions, that they have to base their decisions on. And they said that good leaders are people with people that serve in military service, and that even after war, these leaders are going to be able to run better governments. However, we say that that was not really proven by the proposition side today. They lack basically in language. However, the fact is that the opposition today pointed out these flaws. We took a realistic approach to military service. We told you that military service under the status quo is where you only receive basic knowledge of military training. In military service, we don't teach the participants to become generals. We teach them simply basic fundamental knowledge. And our opposition whip told you that all the males in our society do not have proficient knowledge about how to run a war. And we say that we took a realistic approach today, and that the government side overvalued the importance of military service and overvalued the benefits that it will bring. And now, second of all, we also gave you a realistic point on the military leaders, how it's going to affect the aftermath, which was their third point. Now, they simply took in irrelevant examples. They said that because Myanmar doesn't have mandatory military service, that was why this president made these bad decisions. They did not really provide any linkage to that point. And we actually gave you examples where military service, because of the power that of the generals that run a war, how it actually can have harms in the aftermath as well. And so in the end, they proposed to us a very ineffective policy. And the fact is, the cost of implementing this ineffective policy, as the opposition side clearly stated, was the value of democracy. Now the fact is, the opposition asked the government today why we should implement this dangerous policy that doesn't bring us any benefits if it simply harms the true value of democracy. We pointed out that restricting the people that can actually become a candidate, that can actually lead our democratic nation itself, was a problem because we're restricting who gets to be president. We also told you of the demographics, how some people under the proposition's case are not legible to be president because military service is very important, and obviously women or handicaps that received only community service is only going to lead to destruction when they become presidents in these military unstable nations. So we say that the government side did not prove to us the need, the practicality, and the value of their stance. And we, the opposition, cannot agree to a government that does not fulfill their needs. Thank you.
Speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 28 seconds.
To conclude the government's case and the debate as a whole, I'd like to invite the government reply, Ms. Yeren Yang.
Ladies and gentlemen, in this debate, all three of opposition speakers came up to argue only one thing: democracy, democracy, democracy. Well, to that, we'd like to ask 3 questions. Number 1, does desperate times, such as impending war, calls for desperate measures with some instances? Number 2, did our policy give substitute measures for people like the handicapped and the woman that does not violate democratic principles? And number 3, so should we make a military prerequisite for becoming a president so that we can protect our democratic values? And side proposition says yes to all 3 questions. And as the government replied, I'll be summarizing the premise, principle, and practicality in this debate. First, for premise, we told you and explained to you again and again that we must first survive to thrive. And that it takes, in times of pending war and external threats, that we must have a certain level of military knowledge and experience to defend our country. Yet side opposition still assumes that there is an invisible fine line between the roles of a president and the roles of a military leader. They say it is only the area of military generals to fight against the enemy. First of all, that's not true. The president also has to fight against enemy in the pending instances of war as well, which they did not take into consideration. Secondly, they later went on to say that during the fight, the enemy will start becoming the people. What? Well, there was just a one-liner argument without any logic that was totally dropped by all of their speakers, and we don't see their logic stand. Secondly, they assume that we have military advisors, and therefore these people can make all the decisions of a nation that are related to the military. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, that is not true. And we don't want a president that has to depend 100% on their military leaders. We need a president who can make a solid decision for their country in itself. And secondly, to talk about principle, Team Opposition never gave us a clear value in any of their speeches, but judging by their arguments, I guess they had tried to value gender equality and democracy. 2 things that weren't upheld by their policy, that weren't upheld by their team stance. First, let's examine gender equality. We never said women can't become president, and we never said women can't go to the military. The fact of the matter is they can, and if they want to become a president, then they should. Well, secondly, they talk about democracy, but we told you that the value of democracy is better protected under our side, because without a strong president to guide the country through times of trouble, democracy in a nation cannot stand, as we told you in the examples of Myanmar and Egypt. On the other hand, Team Proposition gave you clearly from our Prime Minister's speech that we stand firmly for the value of national security, and all our 3 substantive points had to do with that. And we also took the opposition's value, which was democracy as well. Thirdly, to talk about practicality, we gave you a clear policy that fulfilled the need, benefit, and solvency. But let us examine this debate in an outside analytical view. Because the fact of the matter is, we're not talking about all countries here, as they agree to our definition, because we're talking about countries like those in the Middle East and in the Balkan Peninsula that have impending threat to security. What happens to these countries when we don't have a president that doesn't know anything about the military? Democracy in that area starts to fall. They might become a dictatorship, and we cannot stand by that. And that is why all our arguments are justified. The only thing they had to say to the policy was that our policy is unnecessary, because if the country already has a necessary military requirement, all people will go to that, right? But that's not true, because an increasing amount of people, especially politicians, are trying to escape the mandatory measures of a military by sending substitutes, and we don't want to see that happen. Secondly, they said that this is somewhat discriminatory to women and handicapped. But then we said women can go to the military if they want to. We're not stopping them. And secondly, we gave you another measure for what the handicapped people do. We can do community service, but this is not talking about picking up trash. We're talking about we're giving them the necessary information to learn about the military as well. So not all restrictions are fair, ladies and gentlemen. For example, in America, you need to be 35 years of age and a natural-born citizen to be president. But yet, we still need to hold our restrictions dear, because without these restrictions, our democratic country cannot survive. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
So we'd like to thank both teams for the debate. You can cross floor, shake hands, and the closing ceremony will start in a couple of minutes.
Do you want me to give you a piece of paper as well?
Nope.
Tap room? All the way there? Do they not have an empty room here? Let's go back here like this one.
There you go.
Well, did you not bring your computer? Logan's here. Okay, where's Logan? He was here. Oh, is it still recording? Probably.